I'm Sean Delaney, and today on the What Got You There podcast, I am joined by Sanjay Ayer, who is a portfolio manager at WCM Investment Management. Now, you might remember WCM because back on episode 312, I interviewed their CEO, Paul Black, which is one of the most popular episodes in the history of this show. Now, on this episode with Sanjay, we explore many fascinating topics like how to improve your return on time in a profession that involves creativity, how Sanjay uses artificial constraints to improve his process, and some of the most impactful strategies and exercises the team at WCM uses to develop their people and assess talent. Please enjoy this conversation with Sanjay. What Got You There is a podcast for high achievers looking to learn from the most successful people of all time what their strategies, lessons, and routines are that made them successful. Now it's your journey, so it's time to learn what's going to get you there. Sanjay, welcome to What Got You There. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Great to be here, Sean.
I'm excited to dive into this, and I want to start with the invisible. I would love to know, has there been a mindset of yours that you think has just been incredibly positively impactful for your life?
Yeah, it's interesting. If to zoom out a bit, I kind of my answer would have evolved to that question over the last 5, 10, 15 years. And that's really because I view my profession, which is investing, as really a kind of a wonderful platform for self-discovery, right? I can't think of a profession that reveals your strengths, your weaknesses, your biases, your flaws, as well as investing goes. So, I've learned a lot about myself over the years, and maybe what's gotten me to this position. And I would highlight two probably attributes that I've kind of really think helped me along the way. The first would be optimism. I think it's it's somewhat of a cliche to talk about optimism, but I think it's incredibly important, especially in fields like investing, where the odds are stacked against you. The base rate of investors that stand the test of time is not that great. So I think you need to have that forward momentum that kind of an undercurrent of optimism provides. And I'm not personally an in-your-face optimist. I don't think people would walk away after a first impression and say, "Wow, that guy's just incredibly optimistic." But and it's funny, I used to think of optimism as a intrinsic quality, but I've come to believe it can be strategic and developed. I don't know if you watched that show on Apple TV called Shrinking. It's a comedy with Harrison Ford and Jason Segel. But there's a supporting character in that show who always uses the line, "Everything goes my way," and it's kind of a cringeworthy line. It's played as an annoying character quirk. But I was reading an interview with the showrunner, Bill Lawrence, and he talked about how he uses that line, "Everything goes my way," in real life, almost to annoy his friends, but it's a strategic kind of facet, because in that field, in media, in show writing, you're dealt body blows every day, with scripts that get turned down and whatnot. It's an incredibly competitive field. So I do think strategic optimism has carried me forward. And then, Sean, I think secondly, just embracing cognitive dissonance has really helped me a lot. And I'm sure your listeners know cognitive dissonance is when you have a worldview, and when you're confronted with something that conflicts with that worldview, for most people that causes discomfort, right? Like the response is to avoid it, rationalize it away, engage in mental gymnastics to kind of resolve those conflicting views. And I've learned, and I've really attuned myself to really embrace and lean into that tension of cognitive dissonance, kind of holding two conflicting thoughts in your head and not lose the ability to think well. And the breakthrough moment for me, Sean, was I used to think that was hard. Like that sounded very hard. It was going to be a harder task mentally to do that, to really hold those opposing thoughts and lean into that tension. But once you get there, it's actually incredibly liberating, right? Because all the biases, that you and I and everyone kind of faces in the world, whether it's confirmation bias, recency bias, anchoring, all those biases really melt away. right? When you're able to see truth for what it is and see change for what it is. So I think it's a good mindset in all walks of life. I think it's highly applicable to financial markets, which we can get into. But and it's something I think I intrinsically had, but really developed it over the years. And so I would pair those two. Unchecked optimism can lead you off a cliff, but optimism paired with an embrace of cognitive dissonance, I think, can put you in a good spot in many walks of life, but especially investing.
You mentioned a minute ago that you were able to break through that. That's why I started this off around the invisible, right? That was a mental limit you were able to get through. I'm wondering, because you're someone who's incredibly self-aware, looking back at that breakthrough ability, what allowed you to do that? What were the steps leading up to that?
It's funny. In high school and even in college, I had a major insecurity, um, and I was very self-conscious about the notion that I didn't have as strong opinions about as many things that everyone else did. It just seemed like you talked to everyone about anything and they would have a strong view on it. And I kind of viewed that as a character liability, if you will, and said, I really should have opinions on any hot topic that comes up or any historical piece of evidence or fact that comes up. And my response to that was to kind of solve for it and try to learn everything about everything, right? So that I could sound smart, right? And have an answer, have a quip, and feel part of those conversations. But it clearly, under the hood, felt very forced, right? It felt like an act. I was doing it because it was something I needed to do to get by, kind of socially and otherwise. And the breakthrough moment, really the first breakthrough moment for me was taking a behavioral psychology class in college that really just delved into the basic question of why do people have different opinions given the same set of facts, right? Or the same set of circumstances. And learning about the why, some of the biases people have, some of the entrenched beliefs and where those beliefs come from. Really, I started to see maybe I was in the right for not having so many opinions about so many things, right? I definitely had strong opinions and always did, but the breadth was not as widespread as seemingly everyone else. And one way to test that you kind of learned in that psychology class was ask anyone with a strong opinion to explain the opposite of that belief, or ask them what it would take to change their mind. And it's startling, right? How quickly people can crumble and not even put together, a semi-coherent response to that very basic question, right? It just kind of bounces off their brain. So that really got me to kind of, let's explore the why people have two different beliefs rather than obsessing kind of over the what the belief is. And that resonated me. It found that it suited me well, and it alleviated me from that kind of burden of feeling that I had to know everything about everything, which I again had viewed as an insecurity, and afterwards did not. I viewed it as almost an asset.
Speaking of assets, you were mentioning a few minutes ago just around optimism and cognitive dissonance. Is you viewed these as skills you became highly attuned to, that you were able to develop. And I'm just wondering for you, what does it look like behind the scenes with you? What are you doing to develop these type of skills? What goes on outside the office that has given you the ability mentally to dive into these, which is something a lot of people don't do, and then keep exploring and going further on them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I find myself just hardwired to a fault, and in fact, I have some morning routines to kind of counter this in a way. But hardwired to just continually try to get better and never feel a kind of fear of complacency and a static life. So I always have this mental energy towards kind of picking apart kind of what I'm not doing well and trying to improve on. And I'm not exactly sure, and I don't know if I've given it enough thought, like the root cause of that. But I frankly have, from as long as I recall, I've always had that kind of internal drive to really push forward, and I've almost helped played a role in creating a culture here at my firm to kind of make everyone kind of give them the opportunity to go down that path. And I think that's really important, because I started off by saying investing is a platform for self-discovery. But it's only if you allow it to be, right? And I think whether self-inflicted or because it's just the profession and how it works, most people are not allowed to be or willing to kind of view investing as a growth mindset kind of industry, right? That you can get better, right? There's this notion of always trying to show off and act like you have all the answers and have a smart quip to every question. But really kind of thinking through holistically in my life, like how do I, this notion of deliberate practice. I'm sure you've heard about it, talked about it. It's been popularized. But the key issue with deliberative practice is you need high signal feedback, right? So it's great to say you want to get better, but do you have the feedback, the raw material to use to get better? And in my profession, you don't have it, right? If you're a long-term investor, you're not making that many decisions. You have long feedback periods, like 3, 5, 10 years to know if you're right or wrong. And even then, there's so much noise in between that they be a very low signal feedback, right? So for me, it's about, I've been really driven in the last 15 years of, taking that hardwired kind of intrinsic quality, getting better, but making sure I was channeling it in a way that was acting on, a set of high signal feedback. So how to create that feedback, and then as importantly, Sean, just how to create time to learn. I'm very, very mindful of like creating guardrails and in my life, both personally and professionally, to channel that energy in the right way. Because I do think that can tip too easily to trying to be a perfectionist and almost never seeing the positive of things. So or taking a step back and just enjoying kind of where you've come over the years. So yeah, that's kind of how I view developing qualities like the two I mentioned.
I'd like to expand on some of those guardrails in a second, but I'm genuinely intrigued. You mentioned that internal drive, that mental energy. Is this more a pulling towards that voracious thirst for more knowledge, or is that more being, I don't want to say fearful, but not liking not exploring your potential?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it's both. I've had a fear of I don't feel as much anymore, but if you asked me 5, 10 years ago, I had kind of a fear of being a fraud, and everyone has this imposter syndrome. But I kind of view, I work at a firm where I'm given a wonderful clean slate to kind of paint a canvas around how to build an effective research culture and research team. And I have strong views on how to do that. But I never want to get caught in just like, talking about things and not acting on them. So really trying to model kind of the behavior and this kind of platform I'm trying to build. That really that's kind of an internal, energy and drive. And it comes from a little bit of fear. I think over the years that fear has waned, and now it's kind of a more organic kind of positive energy and vibe behind that push. But I think that it did probably already start from there, insecurity to some extent, and fear of being a fraud as another source.
You have a great line I wrote down in preparing for this, and you said, "I think everyone needs a little healthy imposter syndrome to do great things." You want to expand on that even?
Yeah, I think everyone has it, and I think everyone. I'm sure some people don't, but I think it's a little bit sad to me that people feel for some people it can really drag them down, the notion of imposter syndrome, right? And so in my view, you can accomplish so much more in life if you just get the insecurities out of the way and they're just totally open about them, right? I'd like to get to a point, and I think we have in our team, where you can joke about each other's insecurities, right? Everyone has them, right? But I think for a variety of reasons, for many, many professions, kind of steer you towards this notion like theater, right? Like acting, like maintaining some label, sounding smart, having a quick answer to every question, pretending you're infallible, sounding the part instead of being the part. I think getting better at your craft. So I think the industry in many professions just do a disservice to, you all know, as you're a kid, none of these things will even come to play at all, right? I think the notion of growth mindset and getting better and asking dumb questions, I think that's intrinsic to people, but they're almost coached out of it in professions like this. So I think imposter syndrome is something I'm I think everyone, at least in our organization, but we wear it as a badge of pride that we're kind of a bunch of imposters, and we're going to lean into it, because to not be an imposter is to do what everyone else is doing, which is to achieve kind of mediocre results, right? Which is kind of what our industry as an aggregate has achieved over the last many decades. So why would you want that to be the outcome? So let's embrace kind of being imposters, being outsiders in a way, and use that as an asset.
How have you walked that tightrope as you evolved in the firm and even now hold a higher leadership position where you're being looked to even more, both in continuing to lead, showing your strengths, showing the knowledge, the wisdom you have accumulated over the years, but also showing that you do make mistakes and also allowing those younger people to see that? You know how it is that tightrope where you want to give them enough ability to make mistakes and learn, but also to develop their own confidence. I'm just wondering how you do that as a leader in the firm.
Sure. Yeah, I think we lead with vulnerability. I think sometimes for many people they need trust before they're vulnerable, and we try to flip that script and say it's very hard to get true trust unless people think everyone in the organization, but especially kind of people in leadership roles, are truly vulnerable. So I talk about mistakes all the time. We had an offsite a couple of years ago where my colleague Mike Trigg and myself, who I co-lead the team with, we had a 50 points slide deck, which talked about every mistake we made over the years, right? And these were cringeworthy mistakes that we looked at and was like, oh my, I can't believe I thought that at that time. So there's many reasons to paper over those mistakes, but if you really want to create a climate where people do feel that it is open, that they're going to make mistakes, that it is forgive and remember, not forgive and forget, you have to just model that behavior, right? So I think leaning into those, and really kind of we left that presentation with the notion of, look, if we're not as a collective cringing at the work we're doing today, 5-10 years from now, like, we're not getting better, right? Let's set that as the bar for getting better. Let's look back 5 years ago, and for many things you do, ask, I can't believe I wrote that or did that piece or made that transaction. I think that means you're on the up and to the right journey. But really, I don't think there's any shortcut. You just have to model the behavior and almost over-index to it to make that point.
Talk to me about that mindset that you have, that a lot of people in your field and that listen to this podcast end up falling into, the category of not feeling like they've done enough, constantly trying to get better. And you said you put up guardrails intentionally to counterbalance that. I'm wondering what that looks like.
Yeah. I mean, just can you restate the question, Sean? Because I just want to make sure I got which way you were going on it.
Yeah, you were just saying about that internal drive that you said you came hardwired, where you just continually wanted to get better, never feeling like you've done enough research or put in enough time. And that's something a lot of us deal with. And I'm wondering, you said you put up guardrails. What do those guardrails look like so people can kind of balance the scales here?
Yeah, so I'm a big believer in artificial constraints. I think in all walks of life, but especially in investing, you need to set up guardrails. Otherwise, you'll just get consumed by all the noise and expiring knowledge that's out there. To that point of kind of having guardrails towards like almost being too hardwired to improve, I like to introduce provocative terms. So, one of the terms I talk about internally is this notion of creative laziness, right? And it's kind of why I like it is because when people hear the term lazy, they immediately recoil, because in fields like this, you're kind of trained and pushed and incentivized to really just work hard, right? And think that hard work is the answer to many things. And everyone loves grit, right? Like, everyone despises laziness and they love grit, right? And I think that's in many ways an inarguable kind of view on both those terms. But I do think grit without a guardrail can lead you astray, right? I think it can mean rushing into things head first, right? Which is brute force, and not asking. A creative laziness to me is that just before answering a question, asking, is this the right question? Or find the lowest part of the fence before you cross it, right? And I think there's some type of an elegance to that that creative laziness brings, and a solution. I think of the Nathan's hot dog eating contest is a kind of a funny example of this, right? You got this guy Kobayashi who won, many of these. How many hot dogs can you eat in, I don't know, was it 3 minutes? And he won it time and again. And he effectively just reframed the question, right? As opposed to how do you eat more hot dogs? He asked, how do you make hot dogs easier to eat? Right. And that's a zoom out. And the way he did is like split the hot dog in half. And I don't want to get into all the gory details, but I think grit can cause you to zoom in too quickly. Right. And so for me, one of the guardrails I put is always think about how can you zoom out before you delve into anything. And we have a reflection week twice a year here at WCM where turn off the stock quotes, turn off the news flow. All you're going to do is kind of sit back and reflect. We have in the office here 2 airplane seats, and the reason business class airplane seats. And the reason we have that is one thing I've learned is most of my best ideas come from airplane rides back from a research trip where I'm sitting across one of my colleagues and we're just downloading, right? And just having a conversation that would never happen in the office. And it's a great kind of reminder that, getting out of the office, carving out time to have conversations that you wouldn't have in the office can just generate creative solutions to things. Whereas if you're too gritty, and you're just in your office with a closed door every day, you could be highly, highly productive, but you might not be effective, right? And I think it's very easy, especially in creative fields, to conflate busyness with productivity. And so having a bunch of guardrails and frankly, just being mindful of that and never wanting to fall in that trap of thinking of just like unproductive busyness, I guess, is something I think a lot about.
What does this look like? I don't want to get super nuanced here, but I'm just curious. What does that look like day to day, week to week? How do you navigate that?
It's tricky because it's kind of great as everything I said sounds. There is just fundamental blocking and tackling,
Yeah.
that this profession requires. You have to write up reports, you have to analyze companies, you have to have meetings. But kind of the undercurrent and the language we use internally is this notion of team return on time. To really think about how do you measure productivity in fields where there's some creativity involved, right? That's an incredibly, to me, interesting design question, an incentive question, because it's, the ways productivity is traditionally defined, what doesn't capture it, right? And I think, for us, it's about how do you pair both those mindsets, get the blocking and tackling done, but always have this kind of notion and mindset and opportunity cost recognition. I think opportunity costs are the biggest challenge in investing. You're not knowing what you're not doing, spelling those out, having processes for discussing those. So here's what I'm going to work on this week, our Monday meeting. Here's what I'm not going to work on this week, right? So being very kind of open, and here's why, right? So being very open about how you're using your time, how you're trading off your time, and then everything you do, you have to argue why is this better for the team, right? I think we don't want to be one of these siloed organizations where people are just optimizing for their own journey. There has to be a mindset of team contribution, how you're giving back and making the collective better. So day to day, it's frankly a challenge. I wouldn't say we've solved it. I think things like Reflection Week, things like various artificial constraints we have can help, but I like to consider it's almost a gravitational pull, right? If you don't have those constraints, you're going to wake up every day, check your phone, see the 3 stocks that were down 10%, come into work, analyze why they were down, call another broker, figure out what's going on in the markets, chat with 3 people, look at all your stock quotes for that day. All of a sudden it's lunchtime. Incredibly reactive mindset you're going to have, right? And you're just going to be playing defense all the time. So, I think we've built a high trust team where we can call each other out now on like, hey, that's expiring knowledge, that's low team return on time, things of that sort. So I think you can hold each other accountable, because even left to my own devices, I would kind of devolve into all the stuff I try to guard against.
Looking back, do you think this would have worked the first 10 years of your career? I'm just thinking about some of that blocking and tackling. I'm wondering how much of those fundamental skills do you just have to put in the time before you can actually use some of that open space to then leverage that?
Yeah, I do. It's a great. I hadn't thought about that, John, but I think that's a great point. I think unless you go through that hard journey and do the blocking and tackling, kind of get dealt a bunch of body blows, make a bunch of mistakes, I think we're big believers in learning from history, but there is a pragmatism that, learning in a vacuum, learning something that happens to yourself is much more powerful than reading about it happening to someone else, right? And I think it just resonates in a much different way. So, if I started my career here and said, "Hey, let's build this platform where people are free to, think different and get better and tune out all the noise," I think people would have looked at me and said, "Okay, that's great. This is an academic exercise. Like, come on, get here, make a few mistakes, then let's see what you have to say." So I think building that credibility and frankly going through that journey such that I can empathize, and I can perspective take for a newer analyst coming in and maybe making those mistakes I made, but sitting back a little bit and letting them kind of learn, the balance you kind of referenced earlier, letting them kind of go on their own journey and learn from those mistakes and maybe take it in a whole different direction. We're big believers in like, I don't have all, me or my co-leaders, we don't have all the answers, right? So trying to force fit something to too precise a degree is not the way we want to go. We want entrepreneurs, innovators internally, and for people to innovate, I do think they have to go through their own journeys. So as I think about your question, I think I needed to several at bats at least to get to a point of credibility and authenticity around some of these points I've been making.
Yeah, it's funny. We so often avoid that pain, but usually it's that pain that provides the most amount of light, right? Like we really need to go through that failure, that hardship to get a deeper level of clarity on things. So I'm wondering for you, what were some of those really deep, dark moments that you had to experience to get to this other side?
Yeah, I laugh because I'm kind of infamous or famous, I guess, internally for going through several midlife crises.
So then that's a serious strength.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. So one of them that is is a fun story we like to share internally is I went to a Taco Bell analyst day back in 2010. And this was when our products were not doing well. I just joined, just was a few years in. I had no kind of great level of self-confidence at that point. One of my stocks that day was down 30% after the market had closed. And so I went to this Taco Bell analyst day and I'm wearing a suit and tie, which, for your listeners, usually at WCM, we dress in flip-flops and shorts. So I'm wearing a suit and tie. They start just showing a commercial, right? Kind of a preview of a commercial Taco Bell is going to air about their new innovation pipeline, right? So it might have been the new cheesy gordita, right, at that point. And so they show this, a bunch of investors, probably 250 investors in the room, all looking very serious and smart. And during that commercial, time just kind of froze. It's just one of those moments where I just took a step back. I looked around the room and I saw people taking notes, right, about this commercial, this new product Taco Bell was innovating that was going to, be 0.001% of their current revenue and just a not negligible part of any intrinsic value Taco Bell would have. And by the way, Taco Bell is part of a larger conglomerate known as Yum Brands. So just like complete noise, right? This is not a relevant commercial or piece of information. Yet there's 250 people in this room who are taking themselves seriously and taking notes, right? Which is bad enough, but guess what? Here I was taking notes too, right? So so the notion of fear of being a fraud at that point in time, I would talk about all the same stuff, some of the stuff we've talked about today about biases and platform and all this, this abstract, aspirational way of how I would build a research culture and a research scene. Yet I was still doing what everyone else was doing, right? So that kind of hit me. Wow, I'm kind of a fraud right now, right? Like I'm saying all these things and I'm doing what everyone else is doing. And it kind of set me on this, it wasn't that dark, but it set me on this kind of journey where really intense self-reflection. I'm like, hey, what am I doing with my life? Why am I kind of spouting all these things, but not acting in a way that's in accordance to kind of how I will say I want to spend my time? How should I even think about time as it relates to investing and how one should spend their time? And it kind of made me realize that investing is one of these professions that and there's a handful out there that have a quotient of creativity to them where it's hard to evaluate talent. It's hard to know if you're any good. Process and outcome are very hard to correlate. There's no defined playbook on how you should do your job. And then I went on this journey of just like thinking about that and understanding, wow, this is really interesting. In all these fields where there's some creativity involved, you would think it's a blank slate, right? So you have this wide canvas to be creative. And there'd be so many different ways people do things, right? There'd be high variability in how people work and how people behave, but it's the exact opposite, right? Counterintuitively, everyone, you look around and everyone's doing the same thing, saying the same thing, acting the same way. And so that really, Sean, I don't think it's ended. It's been a 15 plus year journey of like peeling that onion. Like, hey, why, if this is a creative industry, why do people behave so similarly? Why is it paradoxically an uncreative industry? And it's kind of resulted in a lot of the solutions I've come with is going through that pain of making those mistakes, reflecting on it, and just iterating on how we could build something different here.
Correct me if I'm interpreting this wrong. You go through a pain, you have a setback, you end up asking yourself a new question, and then what it seems like you do really well is you reframe it to a more interesting question in a route. Is that what I'm hearing?
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, I think reframing. I don't know. I kind of think there. If I could teach my kids two superpowers, it'd be one would be reframing, and the other would be just what I call counterfactual balance. I think those two things are incredibly important. Reframing, especially in investing, where you are dealt setbacks all the time, and if you let those kind of just get the most of you and bring you down, it's going to be a problem. So I think in periods like that, I found myself to be adept at, and this might come from the optimism point I made earlier, at always trying to reframe and think, how can this end up being a positive 5, 10 years from now?
Can you just walk me through how you teach that to your kids?
I don't know if I have yet. So I think I always, I'll just always try to reframe things. So it's, oh no, it's raining outside. I'm like, yeah, we get to go play in the rain and do X, Y, Z, or yeah, we get to do a family game night, right? So I think anytime there's complaint, you try to just immediately, instinctively turn it into gratitude, right? Like, here's why something good can come of this. So I think almost intrinsically, just instinctively, just responding to issues like that with the optimistic reframing. But it's interesting. I don't know how you found it, Sean. Like every kid is different, and there are just like I have 3 kids now, and some of them are just hardwired to view things in a different way, and you have to almost coach them out of it, whereas others are more receptive to reframing. So it's an interesting journey, that parallel journey, I guess I'm experiencing on the parenting end.
Yeah, one of the things I've seen out of leaders, so now we're out of the kids realm with the reframing. One of the things I've noticed is it instantly jolts them in a new level of awareness where they don't go down that downward spiral. I think so often that's what people look for. They try to just continue the negativity. It's hard to get out of that. And I think the best leaders, they kind of jolt them with that reframe. And that kind of just opens up their mind to a new possibility to move forward out of that downward spiral. So I think it's something that the good leaders that I've seen do, and I know that you guys practice that at WCM. Another one I want to dive into there, because you said there's 2 things you're going to teach them: counterfactual balance. Let's expand on this.
Yeah, it's interesting. You asked kind of some of the guardrails I have, and I think it's dawned on me in life. There's the counterfactual, just like alternative scenarios that could have played out, right? So kind of the opportunity cost idea. And there's upward counterfactuals, which is like how could things have gone better, and there's downward counterfactuals, which is how could things have been worse. And it's dawned on me over the years that we just, as humans, we just get constant triggers on upward counterfactuals, right? Like what could have gone better? You're stuck in traffic on the way to work, and the lane next to you is moving much faster, right? You notice that. You get annoyed. You switch lanes. You're in a grocery line. You're always in the slow moving line. You come home, you talk about it. You never come home and say, oh, I was in the most normal moving line or the fastest moving line at the grocery store, right? That doesn't dawn on you at the time, because you don't see what downward counterfactuals are non-events, right? By definition, for the most part, they don't happen. So you're just constantly battling this almost uphill treadmill of being inundated with these kind of upward counterfactuals throughout your day of what could have gone better. And it almost acts as an impediment to happiness, right? And to the point of being hardwired, I think I was just always naturally hardwired to be sensitive to upward counterfactuals. Oh, we missed this stock. We should have bought this stock. It went up a lot. It's going to really bring me down, right? I'm not talking about, wow, we missed this other stock and it went down 80%, right? I'm more sensitive to the upward counterfactual. So I've made it a point in my own life to be more aware of downward counterfactuals, what could have gone worse, bring them to life, both at work, at home, and just talk about them more, right? And so try to introduce downward counterfactuals, surface them, create them if need be. I think there's the study, and I think this is somewhat of a contested study, but when they analyzed Olympic medalists, right, they found that bronze medalists were happier than silver medalists, right, which is a counterintuitive conclusion, but they hypothesized it was the silver medalist was engaged in an upward counterfactual. Oh, I just missed getting gold by 2 seconds, whereas the bronze medalist is instinctively confronted with a downward counterfactual. I was 2 seconds away from getting nothing, getting no medal, right? So because there's a different trigger there, you just get a level of happiness and contentment, right? So I think it correlates with the reframing point we talked about, but just I think humans are just not, one of the things we're worst at is non-events, things we don't see, right? When you're sick, you're complaining, oh, I can't wait till I get better. But you never wake up saying, I'm so happy I'm not sick, right? So finding, it's really hard, and I haven't perfected it at all, but just finding ways to kind of tip the scales a little more balanced, that you're not just always letting those upward counterfactuals get you down.
I'm always intrigued by this journey where people kind of cross over another one of these invisible thresholds where they kind of go from knowledge to wisdom around certain things. And it's clear they've attained a level of mastery, whether it be intellectually or actually skill-based. And I'm thinking about this for you. And you said, bring those counterfactuals in earlier. And I'm wondering if that would have taken out some of that innate drive to always kind of have that, you know what, I could have done this better. I could have pushed further here. And it makes me think about those bronze medalists. I wonder if they're even on the podium if they didn't have dreams of gold. So I'm wondering how you navigate that, thinking back to people earlier in their career and throwing those in.
Yeah, I think everyone's different, and I think because I'm just hardwired in a way that's kind of, always being highly sensitive to upward counterfactuals. I don't need that. I need that balance on the downward side. There are other people who kind of view things the other way, and maybe they're not as kind of driven or kind of passionate about self-improvement. It just doesn't, they want to self-improve, but they're not, they don't lose sleep over it, right? And so they might need more in the way of upward counterfactuals. I think it's just, you got to find a pragmatic balance, because what you're optimizing for is the short term and the long term, right? You want that journey, that sharp arc of self-improvement, but you also want it to be durable, right? And I think you don't want to get burned out just because you're just so consumed with the negativity that upward counterfactuals could bring that eventually you just flame out, right? But you don't want that complacency where if you didn't care about that at all, you're just going to kind of waste away. So I think it's almost just having self-awareness and being very attuned to who you are intrinsically, and then figuring out, is there a balance to be had? I would say is how I think about it, and every person's a little bit different, and also it's a pendulum that swings, right? I think over time you can overcorrect one way or another.
This has me thinking about the strategic thinking that WCM has put into the reflection weeks. I think you said you guys do that twice a year. I'm just wondering what that looks like and what you hope comes out of that.
Yeah, so it's number one, it's open-ended, so we're not too prescriptive about what you need to do. The key point is a mindset of reflection, right? Because again, you're drawing guardrails in an industry where this week most people would just be reading earnings transcripts 24/7, right? It's earnings season comes in, and so just creating that notion of this is for reflection, this is for looking backwards in the spirit of getting better. One thing we do mandate during that week, from a process point of view, is what we call a return on time audit, where everyone kind of looks back over the last 6 months and talks about how they spent their time, what were the highest team return on time activities they did, what were some of the lower team return on time activities upon reflection, how would they like to change their return on time over the next 6 months, actions, like a game plan for doing so. And so that's almost a blueprint for how people are thinking about their own time and the team's time. And we didn't know this going in, but it turned out to be a great like mechanism for self accountability. Because now you had this document, you would look back 6 months ago and say, wait a minute, like I said I was going to do this and I didn't execute on it at all. And sometimes there's reasons why, but in many cases, like you just didn't you just didn't execute to the standard you held for yourself. So that team return on time, usually that takes a day because most people here journal and they kind of track how they spend their time. And we've built an app internally that where people log every decision they make, and in the spirit of getting better. So we have tools to help that process. And then beyond that, it's open-ended. So, some people do case studies where they look back and analyze a bunch of recommendations they made, and here's what I learned. They could do a thought piece, like here's how I grew as an investor. I wrote this thought piece about this notion of curiosity, and is there something as passive curiosity versus active curiosity? In my last reflection week, some people have written like documents on what's it like to work with me, so to get a lot of that, the noise out of the way, the friction out of the way. Like here are my pet peeves, here's how I like to work, here's how I like to have meetings, and like so we can understand each other better and like have a shortcut to getting to that point. So it's pretty it's open-ended, but the only kind of mandate we have is a return on time audit, and just we don't want to walk by someone's desk and they're reading the earnings transcript or what have you. I think we try to like hold ourselves accountable to the spirit of reflection.
You said in the last one, you've put some thought into active curiosity versus passive curiosity. Can you share your ideas around that?
Yeah, it's still something I'm kind of wrestling with, Sean. It dawned on me recently that, almost all financial analysts were curious, right? I mean, I think if you just hire for curiosity, that's not that great of effective of a filter. But I think there's a danger of passive curiosity, which is it manifests in a few ways. So I'll define active curiosity as like taking agency over your learning and then communicating in a way that like pushes the ball forward, right? And I think in many learning organizations, which is kind of what we were trying to build at WCM, there's a temptation to take the tack of like learning by osmosis. So just, hey, invite me to a bunch of meetings, let me join group trips, I'll consume a bunch of email flow and I'll get better, right? And I think that's almost a passive manifestation of curiosity. And it might be sound harsh, but it's almost extractive, right? Like you're viewing the team is there to serve you as opposed to you serving the team, right? And there has to be a balance there. And so it dawned on me that we just had a few people here who are highly actively curious. They just learned with a very proactive mindset. They don't wait for others to come to them or that learning to come to them. They just carve out time to get to speed on the whole portfolio, even though that's not their mandate. They're just intrinsically interested in what other people are working on, right? They're just proactively asking questions as opposed to waiting for a meeting. And so they really have kind of think about that give-take balance as it relates to agency over learning. And then one of the things that started to annoy me a little bit was I'd start to see people just put thoughts out there to get their own kind of thoughts out there, right? As opposed to thinking, there's an email chain before you. How can I take what's come before me and build upon it or redirect it? As opposed to, let me just get my views out there. Or let me just throw this like big picture question without making any kind of effort to push the ball forward or come up with even a fledgling solution. So, it's really early this year. I kind of decided, there's probably a point to be made here. And one of the outcomes of that was to make our meetings much smaller, right? Because I thought we were devolving into, hey, everyone's just showing up because they kind of want to learn, which is it's a noble, no one's doing that, through there's no like hidden agenda. People just legitimately want to learn, but it's creating almost a hidden tax on the system, which I'm sure you've thought about like meeting sizes and some of the issues it creates. But I think because we had created that culture of like learning and osmosis, it was a bit of a challenge, right? Trying to make those changes. And I think putting this thought piece out there on active curiosity kind of helped elucidate why it got to a point where we felt like we did have to make those changes.
The idea to write that piece, I'm wondering what other questions do you gravitate towards to spark new ways of thinking for yourself?
No, it's funny because there's sometimes where I think it's very hard to force fit creativity, right? I think you just have to create a lot of space without stimulation, right? So probably my most creative period, Sean, was when I lived up in Santa Monica and I drove down to, we were in Laguna Beach here, our offices, and I do that drive every day, right? This was before I knew about podcasts. And so you just had time to think, right? And I found myself just being highly creative, right? Because it's kind of going on an airplane and not using the Wi-Fi, right? I just was on a 5-hour flight the other day, and I came back with a couple of really creative nuggets. So it's about like, in my mind, it's about immersing yourself in the world, and then almost taking a step back, zooming out, and just thinking about creativity. And there's times like, yeah, I didn't think last year I was very creative. I didn't come up with many novel ideas. This year has felt a lot better, right? And why is that? Did I do anything different from a design standpoint? I'm not sure. But I don't want to, I never want to get to a point where I feel like I'm forcing content out there, thought pieces out there that aren't authentic. And so, what I like to do is just have a, notepad or an Evernote, and just have a bunch of like fledgling ideas or thought pieces that come to mind. And most of them never see the light of day. And then a few, there'll be 2 or 3 things where I'm reminded of it and I add to it over time. And then it hits a threshold where I say, you know what, this has kind of reached a point where I think there's enough meat here to turn it into a piece, and it merits kind of the time I'm going to ask from everyone to read it. So it comes in fits and starts. I wish it was more consistent, but I would say there are times like this year where it's felt a lot more free flowing as far as kind of creativity goes.
Have you ever zoomed out over 5-10 years to see if there's any commonalities or patterns to the time of year that your insights seem to spark the most?
I have not.
That might be an
No.
interesting one for you to do. I've found some certain correlations with that amongst different people. Let's call them different types of creative energy at different times of the year that seem to be pretty resonant of a pattern, which would be a fun one to look at. But I'm also intrigued because you're so intentional with your time, your return on invested time. Also, you have these fun explorations into creativity. So at the beginning of this conversation, you mentioned reading that Bill Lawrence interview. And I'm intrigued why you're reading an article about a showrunner when you're so driven to improve your investing ability.
Yeah, I think and it's hard to convey this in a way that's will resonate with everyone. But I think you have to. One of our core values of the firm is fun. And I think when you decompose creativity, and I'm sure you've given this a lot of thought, like having fun is part of it. I think when you have fun, when you watch a YouTube video, I mean, you've read probably the book Creativity Inc., right? Like Ed Catmull talks about, like a lot of people when they see a group watching YouTube, they'll like if you're a bureaucratic organization, you'll snuff that out and say, "Hey guys, get back to work." But a lot of those creative moments come from that time, and so I think in investing, what's fun is you could borrow from all walks of life, right? So I'm just I think if all I did was be very insular and think about best practices in this industry and how to create the best investment firm and just be blind to other fields of knowledge, I think that does a disservice, right? So I think looking at how other creative people think in different industries, how people have gotten to their position, trying to connect patterns. And, I think the commonality there, which, in part drew my attention was, media, Bill Lawrence. I mean, that's a that's highly, highly creative industry, right? So thinking of, about, it's easy to draw lessons from like process-driven industries, like whatever, Danaher Business System, like very cut and dry. But how can you also intelligently borrow practices from more creative industries like that? So that's kind of how I'm wired. And I think part of it's intentional, and part of it's just making sure you introduce the groundwork for just having fun and something coming out of it, right? I think you can get if you get too consumed with personal productivity, it just becomes a different. This is my view. If you become too consumed with that, it's just a different form of busyness, right? So you just have to be intentional and like, what do you mean by productivity? How are you measuring it? And if you don't allow for some of that, softer work, reading about things that 90% of the time, 95% of the time, 98% of the time won't have any payback. You're going to miss that 1 or 2% that will lead through those breakthrough moments you talked about.
Have you read Rick Rubin's new book?
I enjoyed it.
I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
It's interesting, right? That's a highly creative field, and I think he talks about things like having a clean slate as it relates to any rules, right? And not thinking about thinking about things from a true first principles mindset. And listening to his podcast here and there, and reading that book, it's refreshing, right? In a way, it's like almost at times in his career where he just kind of rebuilt everything from a clean slate. It's like, forget everything I've learned. Let's kind of take this in a new direction, and all that stuff you learned, like the important stuff, will filter back in. But you'll cut out a lot of maybe the bad habits and nonsense that's been practiced. And you look at his success, obviously over a long course of time, over different genres, and there's something definitively to be learned there. I mean, there was stuff in the book where I was like, I don't really know how to apply this, but there were definite nuggets that were, quite interesting.
Yeah, there's a depth, almost a spiritual element to
For sure
his exploration and creativity. He also throws in a lot of constraints, like he mentioned. He'll throw in different times and beats and things like that to navigate it. So if you're interested in creativity, that might be one to explore. I am curious for you though. Do you believe you need a deep love of the craft you're in to become great at it?
I do, Sean. I think I think it's a non-negotiable. I think if you don't really love what you do, like the notion of active curiosity, that when it works, it's when it comes from a place of authenticity. You're just so curious and excited and passionate about the field you're in, that you're just going to go the extra mile, work on a weekend, whatever it takes to kind of, you're going to have dreams about kind of the industry. It consumes you, right? I think, I'm sure there's people who've done very well with that passion. So I don't want to say it's a total, it's an absolute, but I'd say, it's just you're spring loading yourself much better if that's your starting point. If you give me people who are passionate and self-aware, we can work with them. Those are the two kind of raw ingredients I think you need. And I even use the term love. Like, do you really love what you do, right? A lot of people like what they do. And I think that can get you to a good place, but there's probably a ceiling there. If you love what you do, I think I think the potential is in many cases limitless.
How did that show up for you in the early days? How did you know, or were you still just kind of, tapping your cane in the fog in the early days, trying to figure it out, and then all of a sudden you realized there was a certain depth of love you had for the craft?
More cane in the fog. I think I knew I liked it. I knew it was intriguing to me. There were some things that really resonated with me. And then, when I really, where we started, like this investing as a platform for self-discovery, when I realized like, wow, this is tremendous. I get to learn so much about myself, magnify what's good, try to fix what's bad. Like, that just became almost a passion project, right? And that's where it was clearly about building portfolios and generating performance for clients, but having a parallel journey that contributed to that was, trying to figure things out as it relates to myself and building the team that can stand the test of time and really conquer the base rates of the industry. And that's, from a design standpoint, I've just become incredibly curious and passionate about how to solve for some of those challenges that are just intrinsic. So I would say I always liked the industry. I'd have to think about when to tip to love, but I would say it's been at least a decade where I felt, you know what, I can't see myself doing anything but this. It's just too interesting, and the problems opportunities just come in ever changing shapes and sizes. So it's hard not to kind of keep that heartbeat going.
You sent me over some notes as we were preparing for this conversation. You said game selection and design.
Mm.
I'd love to know what you want to dive into there.
Oh, it's in some ways a Kobayashi reference I talked about. It's just like make sure you design your game in tune with who you are, and where you can differentiate yourself, and then build a toolkit that's highly aligned with that, right? So for us, it's about long term. We play the long term game, right? And so you have long term capital, and so that's an advantage, right? Because we're very kind of candid with clients. Here's when we're going to do well. Here the environment's going to be tougher for us. We're very transparent on the front end. So making sure with that long term time frame, you have a toolkit that enables long term performance, right? So for instance, if you were trying to outperform the market every quarter or every month, let's take an extreme, every month, you would need an incredibly broad toolkit, right? Like you would need to pivot your portfolio every month to kind of catch the flavor of the day. And that's fine, right? That can work for managers. I don't ever kind of say there's one way to do things, but you just need alignment. Like what are the tools you have, and is it aligned with the game you're playing? If you're playing a longer term game, for instance, like you can have a more narrow toolkit, right? If it's too narrow, then you run the risk of like expiration, like that toolkit just being in the right place, right time, and the world changes, and you're out of luck. So just being pragmatic about like what is the game you're playing? Do you have a toolkit aligned with that? Do you have a capital base in our field that's aligned with that? And then what are you trying to do on a day-to-day basis, right? Like if you're just doing all blocking and tackling, how does that align with kind of the game you're playing, right? Is it truly sustainable? And so for us, it's about how do you balance blocking and tackling with research and development? How do you balance like building compounding knowledge, right? That makes the whole team better and creates durability. And so how do you incentivize people based on the game you're playing, right? The way you keep score defines the game you're going to play. So, and then how do we always want to create luck, right? I've read a great quote, luck is a residue of design, right? So how can you design your organization in a way that you just expose yourself to good luck, right? Over time, good fortune. So I think for us, holistically, or for me, holistically, just thinking about game selection, and frankly, we were in a very privileged position. We picked a game early on, not to get too in the weeds about investing, but we picked a game which didn't have much competition, non-US growth at the time we launched it, 2004, for a variety of reasons. It wasn't a very competitive field, right? And so it's a great time. It's the best possible scenario where you have something that's differentiated in the field where there's very little competition. You'd love to kind of tap as many veins like that as you can. So that notion of game selection, being very mindful, it's again zooming out before you zoom in. What's the game you're playing? Do you have a toolkit aligned with that? How are you keeping score? Just asking this question. So just being mindful of it, I think, is really important in any walk of life.
You said you want to increase the luck. How do you strategically do that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for us, this is not doesn't have to be for everyone. It's about having an entrepreneurial nature. So, I think taking risks, capitalizing on things that come in front of you with a kind of a positive, optimistic mindset. I think too many firms, and CEO Paul Black talks about this a lot. A lot of firms get too caught up in a vision. Right? Here's my 5-year vision of what I want to be. And you end up, if you're just too laser focused on a vision, you can miss what's right in front of you, right? Opportunities are right in front of you, and you just are too focused on, where you want to go in an abstract sense. So having a firm that plants a lot of seeds, and will invest in long-term research and development, will not be too hardcore about kind of near-term payback periods on things. Let play in the long game. Having kind of guardrails for accountability, but making sure we're kind of taking various kind of bets, and this is not even just on the portfolio. It's just different initiatives to make our research process and philosophy better. And so there's lots of examples of that we kind of incubate things, let them build ownership around them, let people run with ideas. So I think one thing we've done well is really build an entrepreneurial culture. And I think that in many ways just tips you towards good outcomes, right? Or fortune. When something does kind of spring to be something big, you're there, right? You had something, you were focused on it, maybe when it wasn't in vogue. So I think that's important. And then, some of the stuff we've already talked about, reflection week, carving out time for creativity, I think that almost definitionally will tip you towards, potentially at least being lucky over time.
Yeah, you mentioned Paul Black. He was back on episode 312. Excellent episode. I still get a lot of emails about. So if you guys are interested in that, check that out. I'm curious, Sanjay, you mentioned there that entrepreneurial drive and that spirit within the firm, and you said you build that. Can that be built by bringing in people without an entrepreneurial mindset and developing that? Or does it have to start with they are hardwired with an entrepreneurial spirit and they get thrown into the system?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think you can nudge people, right? To people who might not believe in themselves enough to take those entrepreneurial bets, just maybe a little more risk averse. I think you can nudge them out of that. And I think especially, I think in investing there, people get sabotaged. It almost sabotages people from like innate creativity. So, I think you want to be mindful of when you're interviewing someone or you're hiring someone, do they say things that surprise you? Do they show some entrepreneurial bent? Maybe that's been quashed in the firms they've worked at, but is there some fire there? Right? I think that's important, even if it hasn't manifested itself in high levels of entrepreneurialism. So I think you need, and we try to tease this out through our hiring. I think you do need some element of betting on yourself, taking risks. When we hire people, we're much more focused on the arc of their career trajectory. We could care less about school they went to or number of, whatever CFAs and other degrees they have. It's about kind of where'd you start and where you are today? How did you when did you bet on yourself? So I think I think you can nudge certain people into more of an entrepreneurial mindset, but I think it's very hard if you have no evidence of any fire along those lines to really create something out of it.
Yeah, we're going to wrap up here in a few minutes, but I'm curious, what else are you trying to tease out in that hiring process?
Yeah, Sean, I think as far as the qualities we look for, I think the non-negotiables would be people who truly love what they do, the craft of investing. Self-awareness is critical. And then just given the industry and the ups and downs, resilience would be kind of the third. Kind of permission to play quality. And then when you get beyond that, I just jump to the core values of our research team, which one is think different, which, my shorthand for evaluating that is, during interviews, just keeping a tally mark anytime someone says something that makes me think, oh, that's interesting, whatever it is, that makes me, I think that correlates well with kind of that think different mindset. Second would be get better. And that for me is really scoping out the trajectory of the person's journey, if not career. We're much less worried about pedigree, credentials, what have you, just much more interested in the slope of kind of where that person has come over time and how they've grown. And the last core value is kind of make the team better, which distilling down that team mindset can be a challenge. A lot of people in this industry have been trained to self-optimize for themselves. But for just in our culture, it's really important that people wake up thinking, how can I make the collective better? And some of the qualities, we look for their active curiosity, of course, and I would say founders mentality, people who, regardless of literal ownership in the business, really act and feel like owners of what we do. And then the last point is, as we alluded to earlier, I think we just have a strong preference for an entrepreneurial gene. This is a I think WCM is a bit of a choose your own adventure type journey here. If you want a defined role, you can have it, but we tend to prefer people who really push the boundaries of what they of kind of their scope of their work, and really reinvent or even invent their own roles over time. So I think that captures a lot of it. Our processes are very methodical, I would say, as far as hiring and evaluating talent. But those are, several of the qualities that come to mind immediately.
So Sanjay, say you could not invest. You had to walk away from WCM for the next 3 years. What would you love just spending time on over the next 3 years?
Yeah, I'm a huge sports fan, and there's always, I love that world. It's got comparable components to what we do. So if I was in investing and you made me a general manager for a basketball team or something, I'd probably enjoy that.
What insights do you have that you're not seeing general managers execute on right now that you would bring into your organization?
I think you're starting to see the scales tip, but just thinking different, right? I think a lot of these industries are still sports are still stuck in the past, right? So you start to see with the Moneyball phenomenon, people start to think differently and introduce more first principles thinking. But even simple things like Michael Mauboussin talks about, hey, if you're an underdog, you should introduce luck into the game. If you're a heavy favorite, you want to simplify the game as much. I think that's a highly intuitive, pragmatic take. And so, if you're a team and you're a 20-point underdog in a football game, you should probably do some kind of crazy off the wall things to just create complexity and luck, introduce luck, and maybe tip the scales to your team's favor. And I think you've seen Super Bowls where I think it was the Eagles did an onside kick, to start the game. And I think that's and that's to my mind, you don't see enough of that, right? In tennis, for instance, I think if you invented an artificial intelligence tennis player, they would play the game dramatically different, probably, than the way the game's been played, right? They'd probably do crazy drop shots all the time, do weird serve, just create all sorts of angles and different types of element. But I think there's just that's a sport that's just so steeped in tradition, and there's a way the game's supposed to be played that it's been resistant to a lot of change, and so I'm always intrigued by, hey, if you really introduce kind of first principles thinking into these sports, what would they look like? So who knows? I'd probably flame out in any of these fields, but it'd be an interesting journey to try out. And if I didn't do that, I'd probably be an entrepreneur of some sort.
Well, you'd definitely be thinking differently. So Sanjay, final one here. Say you could do this. Sit down, long form interview, anyone dead or alive. Who would you love to sit down with and just ask questions of?
I guess I'd do people I admire, Sean, and people I admire are probably people who have been successful and are still very humble. So since we're talking about sports, it's top of mind, like Carlos Alcaraz. You look at that kid, 20 something years old, just how I mean, number one player in the world, I think, or at least was, just how humble he was and how he reacted to that US Open loss in his interview about hey, this just taught me I'm not up to snuff. I need to get better. That's next level thinking at that age. And so I'm sure, you could just learn a ton talking to someone like that. And it'd be fun. He seems like a really kind of a positive, energetic young kid who has a lot to, the best is ahead of him. So that's, kind of one person that jumps to mind.
Sanjay, this has been great. I think we've only hit the tip of the iceberg here in topics we could explore that I would love to at some point. But where do you want the listeners staying connected with what you guys are doing at WCM?
Yeah, I think we are, WCM, we've been through this journey of kind of starting from a more insular firm and are now kind of, becoming more of a known quantity. But we're out there. We're on LinkedIn. We do a few podcasts here and there. We don't do too much media, but We're always hiring. We're always looking for great people opportunistically. And so, yeah, feel free to, if any of this resonates with anyone, feel free to reach out and, we'd love to chat.
Great. Well, thanks again.